The scene is set deep within the mind of John Stanshope. John slips back into the recesses of his mind, folding in on himself like origami, visualizing a long corridor, stretching out into eternity. Like two mirrors facing each other, he strides through, placing a hand on the wall, feeling the tactile memories run across. The mind was odd that way. Occasionally it needed coaxing. Like seducing a retired maid, you had to tease it back to life. As vast and precise as John's mind was, the path he was travelling was somewhere he hasn't been for a long time. He didn't relish the thought. Nostalgia and regret was never productive. But to build anything, you must start with the foundation. To know where one originates was a base, a stance, a bedrock in which to defend himself for the battles that lie ahead. He continued walking. The colour drained from the background, giving it a dulled, hazy feel. Soundlessly, his footsteps continue along the plain floor. And he felt it. The feel of cobblestone on the soles of his feet. The faint flurry of a smell. The straining of an image in the corner of his eye. The feeling of coarse cloth, of soil squeezed between his hands. Each was fleeting, barely solid at all. Like smoke, as soon as you grasp for it, it slips away and disperses. A voice echoes, not his own. Focus. A faint smell strayed on the edges of recollection. There, he thought. Focus on it. The viscous, sweet smell. Glazed pork. The fat sizzling on the stove. Yes. The old cottage. Herbs in the garden. The wet soil. The crackle of the stove and the fireplace. John looked up and found himself in a small cottage. His parents' house. Mother cooking on the stove, the brightly coloured Pinny strapped to herself, singing a nameless tune. Her smile was broad and inviting. Other memories pushed into the scene, like a ball of string flung to the floor. They were all connected and integrated, each pleading to be recalled. He thought, strange. Why here? Focus on the memory. When was this? I was young, very young. Too young to know how rare it was to see Mother smiling. Too young to understand why she slept so much, or who the strangers in the house were. The memory sharpened into focus. John paced around the room, checking the details. The labels on the bottle, the items in the pantry, the folds in her skirts. There. Got it. The world came into view of John's early life. A small house in Surrey, a pleasant cottage by the river, bought by her family's money, of course. It was an inviting place when it was just the two of them. When father returned from sea, it became different. It became colder. Because it was his. There's not much of John's early life he ever wishes to remember. He did not have what modern kindred would call a happy childhood. Many he's met during his time, especially those prevalent in fraud, seem fascinated with a kindred's early life. "Tell me about your mother," they'd say, and John would smile sweetly. Times were very different then. His mother was wealthy to her family standards. Her father sold iron and metalworks, respectable middle class, especially in the great boom of the British Empire. 1890 was when he was born, a fine year, a year of great decadence, great hope, striving to unbetter oneself, as we were the keepers of the world. Many thought like this, ignoring the throngs of humanity that pushed and struggled, barely being able to put food on one's table. The empire was built on blood, and it wasn't always in foreign lands. When John was a small boy, memories were of two very stark contrasts. He was generally kept to himself. The idea at that time is children were some distraction that was seen and not heard. He spent most of his time in the garden or out in the parks. His mother and definitely his father cared little of where he went, as long as he came home. Occasionally, he would be treated with a cooked meal, but most of the times he had to fend for himself. Mother drank a lot. Gin was the popular drink at that point, and travelling salesmen, especially one of the upper persuasions, would often bring little green vials showing various narcotics and pharmaceutical drugs that were all the rage in London to wealthy men and women. And since Mother had so much time on her hands, she indulged, perhaps a little too much. This was something that the young John couldn't understand, although in recollection he understands why. His father was a merchant sailor, not a evil man by any stretch in retrospect. Very strict, military-minded, he liked his house in order. He wanted everything run as his ship was run. To the point, tight, organised. No lip, no back chat. People would do as they're told when they were told it. When he returned home, things were difficult. Many people would gasp at the treatment a husband would put a wife through in those times, but no one ever talked about it. It was unpatriotic. No one needed to know what happened behind closed doors, and the Victorian mindset was that's where they should stay. Rouge was popular, and the occasional black eye or split lip was easily remedied. There was very little of John's early life that he particularly wanted to recall, but he had to make sure. He scanned the memories, making sure he remembered every detail, every sharp pain, every slash of the belt, every sweet cake, every small toy, the way its paint flecked and freckled, the sound of the wooden hoop as he pushed it along the cobbled streets. These were all important. They were important because he needs to know if anything's been changed. It took a while, agonizingly so, a snail's pace to go through each and every memory. It was work he had to do, for here and there he could see the small effects, the echoes of the elder, something out of place or not belonging. A can of Coke, perhaps, or a strange, furry, fuzzy image that would skitter like a spider across the field of vision. This is where the madness has set its cracks. And as patient as any great artist, Any great stonemason, any great architect, he would pick out those pieces and smooth them over, drawing upon other memories. Every crack required intense amount of detail, for it was too easy to get focused in and fall. The small crack would become a ravine of bubbling madness in which he would find himself catatonic. Occasionally, when he wasn't focusing hard enough, he would realize that the whole week had gone. He occasionally resurfaced the uppermost of his thoughts, sometimes dragged out by the psychic pull of Calliope. He used that to anchor himself, although he would never admit it, far too prideful to realize, or at least admit, that he needed help, especially when battling his own mind. It was his great strength, after all. The one thing that he did have that wasn't taken away from him. A door appears. This door John knew very well, for he had visited it often. It is easily barred shut. A careful lock. Not boarded up, not denied. It was somewhere that he went back and forth when he chose, but it was somewhere he preferred to keep locked, so he wouldn't casually stroll into it. But now he has to go in. He pressed his hand on the door, his hand, briefly, that of a small child, barely 8 years old. As old as she was. A voice whispered, dark and sultry. He could hear the flies and the other vermin buzz around it. His beast was always there, willing to drag him down, willing to pull the memories he wishes to deny himself ever closer to the surface. Before you turned her. Before you made her a monster like you. John put the thought aside. The image of a small, delicate hand within his was boxed away and walled off. It was not the time yet. That was a long way away. The door opened, pushed feebly by infantile hands, displaying a crowded living room. Like the rumble of thunder, snoring was heard, and the large, overweight form of his father lay sprawled across the couch. His red, spotted face, his blubbering second chin. John remembers all the imperfections of the man's face very well. He never had a high opinion of him, and he was so very alien when he was a boy. His balding head and squint eyes, his calloused hands, large and imposing. The tight belt lay unbuckled and open to the side. John remembers his heart racing, his throat trying to leap out of his mouth as he crept, toe, heel, toe, heel. Looking down, seeing the carnage which his father brought from one of his nights on the town. The glittering green glass lay there, shining invitingly in the fire. He picks it up. The pain in his hand as he grips it tightly, fearful of what he should do. And then the slow sliding of the sharp point in a blubberous neck, and the warm sensation of the thick blood bursting forth from that sack of flesh. John's beast curled out of the darkness like a slim shadow, lapping up the feelings and emotions, the hatred that poured off the young John. This was its fuel. Death and blood. The great pretender grew fat with it. The infantile John's memories were that of fear and not quite understanding. He just wanted to hurt him. Hurt him like he hurt Mother. Hurt him like he hurt him. It was always better when he wasn't around. Well, just like the chickens he had to kill for today's supper. He would cook father. John remembers in stark detail the light coming out of the man's eyes, the anger, shock, and betrayal that were with them. John stepped out of the memory and watched it. He looked around, freezing it for a moment so he can analyze it. There and there, in the blood splatter, in the weave of the carpet, something shifted. It's been here. Like the muddy footprints of intruders, there, its passing is noticed. This didn't surprise him. This was a buried thought, something someone would want to ferret out. He gets the work, brings on his doctor's bedside manner, cold, detached, like a surgeon going through a loved one's heart. He worked away, quite oblivious to the actual horror of the scene. Once done, John stepped neatly out of the room and closed the door, and with a sigh, continued down the corridor. He went through the rest of the memories, the flashing images. It all had been quite a shock to the young boy, and so, as John remembers, it's all quite fragmented, fading from one way to another. John's mother was accused. She was sentenced, and as far as John was aware, probably hung, although it was never confirmed. He himself was put up for adoption, and then failing that, as there are thousands of young orphans in that time, was put to work in the workhouse. John strolled around the workhouse floor, remember the faces of the boys in which he had the brief association with, those he liked, those he didn't. John was a slight youth, not as big or brawn as some of the others, not from, well, that stock. And so he went from one nightmare to another. The foolishness of youth. And a lesson learned, there's always somewhere worse. The work was satisfying, at least in that all the boys can focus on a singular task and not realize how hungry they are, how tired, how their bones ached or how their lungs hurt, how climbing into the great machines for textiles was seen as a great adventure until the first accident. You don't get many old workhouse boys. He skipped through until he finds a much more pleasant memory. Mr. Weaver's bookshop. John had been one of the few lucky ones who was actually picked out to work elsewhere. This was mainly due to the fact that he was literate. It was a rarity at the time, especially for one of John's social class. He was lucky enough that in her more sober moments, his mother decided to teach him his letters. And that was probably the greatest gift she had ever given him. The world of books was a distraction, a wondrous land, places that he would never see, adventures that could be had. It was slow going, but John had taught himself to read. He spent a great time in these memories. He read so many books at that time, it was fun to reread them. Many books of history in ancient places, of the great British Empire, all under the careful tutelage of Mr. Weaver. The man was jolly in a spindly kind of way, direct but kindly. It was at this time that he would hawk his wares to various passers-by for penny dreadfuls and other such tosh that can't be put onto the books proper. He made quite fun time. John takes a moment. What happened to that young boy, he thought, after the horrors of his early life, of the workhouse, suddenly coming into his own. He was a quick study, and the world of books was a wondrous gift. He hungered for it, for knowledge. He wanted to swim out of his own ignorance. He felt like he was drowning in it. So many books piled high, first editions. Now, he held a few. It was there the curse began. The curse of knowing your place in society. He remembers very vividly asking Mr. Weaver, "May I one day own a mansion and have servants?" "Oh, hope stands eternal, Jimmy, my boy," he would always say. Jolly chap though he is, and a kindly soul, he didn't have the heart to break a child's dreams. But broken they were. For this was not a period of high climbers. This was not a period that belayed people getting ideas above themselves. But the idea had snuck in John, or, as he was known then, Jimmy. He would make an active effort to better himself. He would watch all the knobby boys, the way they spoke, the way they talked. He would see the finely dressed men and women and sell his books closer and closer to the theatre district, wowing in awe at their carriages, horses, the fine swords or blades that the men wore, the petticoats that the young ladies did, the way they curtsied, their manners, the way that the kind Christian souls would occasionally part words with a poor bookseller. For its horrors, John misses that time. There's a great hope in the early part of the 19th century, a rightness, perhaps self-righteous, he cares to admit, but it was when the British Empire believed it was doing the right thing. It was a world of hypocrisy, but they had not woken up from it. They had not realized their utter insignificance in the world just yet. They owned half the globe, and it wasn't slowing. They were giving civilization and Christian virtue to the less fortunate. Sometimes he wishes that this modern era would be more like that. To be more about moral fiber, rather than this gaudy light show, and this constant hunger for information and entertainment. It was hard enough to stomach some of the younger kind, their ignorance, their lack of drive, their great apathy. Kind nowadays were a bare shadow of what humanity dared to dream to be back when he was still alive. John slowly sorted through these memories, savouring every word from every page, every feeling, every taste of food, every sip of a drink, every dilemma, the pang of hunger, the dryness of thirst, the pain of living. This was the first time in quite a while that John had really connected with the mortal part of his memories. It was sobering to remember how fragile we all were, how innocent. It's easy to forget in the decades or even centuries in which you become kindred. A taste bubbles forth on the back of his tongue. John smiles, his chest inflates. He was looking forward to this bit. Wine. John had loved wine. As a young man, he craved it. Not only the taste and the texture, but the knowledge of it. He enjoyed partaking in the snobbery, knowing the vineyards, the grape, exactly who was buying what and what was in season, what was in fashion. He had learnt wine in his first real job as a young man. With a bit of charm and knowing the right people, John made friends quickly. He had landed himself a job at Ascot as a busboy, foolishly believing that he himself could perhaps mingle with the upper crust, that he would be sponsored by some great lord or lady who would see his talent through his shabby uniform and say, "Him, yes, him. I need you, lad, to attend me, and I'll leave you my great estate." Such foolish dreams. It was there that an adolescent John truly saw the impossible task of what lay before him, of how society and the entire world was poised against young busboys attempting to be nobility. So he found his solace in wine, a common thing for adolescents. He remembers the face of his old friend, Harold, who was a sommelier of the racetrack. They would drink long into the night. John would pester him for questions, and he would be happy to reply. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. Then came something that no one was expecting. The Great War. When it started, John felt elated, excited. Go and join the war. Come on, lads, join your local regiment. It'll be over by Christmas. The pay was extraordinary. The benefits, exceptional. The education offered, unbelievable. For someone as lowly as him to be educated, it was an offer that you could hardly refuse. He had joined up straight away, eager to go to the recruiting office, sign his name away, lying about his age, of course. Many boys did then. He had been picked out of basic training for someone with a sharp mind and a steady hand. He was a batsman of a medical officer and was taught, although with drips and drafts, to be a field medic. He had taken the education and certainly lavished in it, learning the basic battlefield medics, and soon became what was lovingly recalled to as a medical officer. But what he really was a medical servant. The ability to cut off limbs and to give a man a lethal dose of morphine to spare his painful end was pretty much all that a field medic did, although John was happy to recollect he did save a few lives. Although, everything has a cost. It was here that John took a step back, a shuddering. He got too invested into the memories, into the education. The faces of the dead men littered across the field started to speak to him, started to whisper, to chant. You are nothing. Go to sleep. Quiet. You. Thousands of voices put up into a cacophony. Even the thunder seemed to whisper. The mud turned a dismal grey, and then deepened to that of red, became soggy. An echo was here. And slowly, John can hear that terrible whistle. Time froze. It was the whistle of a mortar shell. It impacted, and John drowned in the mud.